The 1940 census, measuring a changing nation. And I have some points here, and all of these points really speak to the information that we needed as a nation at this particular time. This is just a little snapshot of one of the actual forms. There was a growing demand for business statistics. Business owners wanted to know, where should I locate my business, or where should I expand? If I want to expand, where should I place that next business? And by getting data from the Census Bureau, they can see, in certain areas, there may be a need for whatever they are selling. Also for marketing purposes as well. There was also a growth in the social sciences during this period. And so, say, sociologists wanted to know from 1930 to 1940, how did people's lives change? What did they move? Did they go from being maybe affluent to very poor? They're very interested in how people's lives had changed in the last decade. And of course, a very big one, evaluating the effectiveness of the New Deal programs set forth by Roosevelt shortly after he came into office. And those programs were instated from 1933 to 1936. And really the purpose of those programs was to get people back to work, relief, right? Economic relief. So people would have money, they would have a job where so many people did not, and they would be able to put some of that money back in the economy as well. So sort of a personal unemployment relief and total economic recovery certainly was hoped for. And the last one, relief, recovery, reform. So I guess you could really put different examples with all of these, but I guess another part of recovery too would be all of the roads, the infrastructure that was built and improved from these New Deal programs, and certainly a reform as well. That's the third R. People also hope that this data would assist in mobilizations of war effort if needed, because at this time, when they were writing the form, and even when we conducted the census, we weren't involved in World War II at that time. But it could be seen that would likely be something that would happen, that we would get involved in the near future. And if that happened, we had to have some specific information. We needed to know the number of surgeons or dentists, nurses, doctors in general in a particular area. We needed to know the number of women that were of work age. So we needed to know a lot of information just in case that happened, so we would be ready. And we also needed to know just the total population, so we would be able to provide relief efforts if needed, if there be a lot of disaster on our soil. So now we're really getting into the 1940 census. It's a sign of the times, right? It reflects the times, and it really needs to do that, because if not, it's outmoded, right? We need answers to questions that are affecting us at that current point in time. So we were emerging from the Great Depression. We obviously needed information on unemployment and income. We also wanted to know how the Great Depression affected people in terms of where they lived and their residence. Did they move for a particular reason? And if they moved, where did they move from? So this is the first time that we ask about that. What was your residence 5 years ago? That is another question that has continued on, and it is all in all of our censuses and also in many of our surveys as well. Education, a question on years of school completed actually replaced the literacy question. So that's interesting. It shows sort of a progress of our nation in terms of education. Housing. This was the first housing census. Now, the housing census data will not be made available. Those records were destroyed, and I don't have any other information on that. I hoped I'd have a good tidbit, but I don't. They were destroyed, but what you will find out is on the population census, we did ask two questions that concerned housing. Do you own or rent? And how much do you pay in your mortgage, or how much do you pay in rent? So you will get answers to those two questions because they were on the population schedule, not the housing schedule. This was the first time we had asked questions about housing. So it seemed very, very different to the people that were creating this form, and that could be another reason why there was a separate form. The first modern census, that was the first time we utilized the sample survey, a sample survey of about 5% of the population. The first PR campaign as well. It just reminded me when I read it very much of how we conduct censuses today, truly modern censuses. It's very important to make relationships with media and to make relationships with businesses and state and local representatives to really help us get the word out about the census, why it's so important, as I had discussed earlier, for federal funding, for congressional reapportionment, but we really, needed to nail home the point that counting everyone was key. So that is where that first PR campaign came in, and you'll see some of the pictures and other things you see were actually pieces of that PR campaign, and we made thousands of connections with both media but also individuals during and before actually the 1940 census. What this shows you is, and I'll just read off the major column headings, okay, starting from the left: location, household data, so that's that small amount of household information you're going to get, name, relation, personal description, education, place of birth, citizenship. Here's the question: the residence is as of April 1st, 1935. What was your residence, or where was your residence 5 years ago? Now, if you had moved from a place that had, which would be a city or a town, that had less than 2,600 people, they were actually, the enumerators were instructed, and I know you can't see this, to write in an R. And that population was as of the 1930 census. So I'm not exactly sure if the enumerators knew. I don't think they would necessarily know what if the population was over 2,600. We may have asked the respondent, or that may have been something that came later. But that was one of the enumerators' instructions. And I think that those enumerator instructions are important for you all if you're doing family history, because you can get a better idea of why the responses that were given were actually given. And I know that all of the enumerator instructions are online. I know through the National Archives, I believe through the Census Bureau as well. So these were special instructions given to the enumerator on how to actually count the residents when they were out and about. Enumeration district, I don't want to forget this. Enumeration districts are generally how they sort of correspond to a workload. One enumeration district would take someone that was working in a city area about 2 weeks to complete, okay? But maybe in a more rural area it would take about a month. So just to give you an idea of the enumeration district and how that relates sort of to the length of time, to the length of work that the enumerators had in front of them. Now at the bottom we see employment status. So we asked quite a bit of questions on employment status, such as occupation, industry, occupation, and this one is rivet, melter, or something, and they actually created them. And I mean, it's just really a sign of the times that was an example that we put, labor, salesman, or other examples. One thing we wanted to get also out of this picture is to understand the job that someone had. Is this really what they were educated for? Is this what they were trained for? I'm not exactly sure if we got at that, but that was certainly a need of the times, because we knew that people had moved for work, just taking any job they could to make ends meet. Even if maybe, they had another occupation before the Depression, still, they had to just pick up and do whatever they could. And then, of course, we collected information on income as well. There was a separate form. This is kind of a fun fact. There was a separate form, and I did not find a digital copy of it or a picture of it, that if people did not want to answer the income question verbally, there was a form and they could write it in, and it came with an envelope, and they would just write it down, put it in the envelope, seal it, and give it to the enumerator. And I believe in the next census what they decided to do, they had the same basic operation, but instead of giving it to the enumerator, they would mail it in on their own. So I guess it's just a privacy thing. And we certainly want people to answer questions, as many questions as possible, so we can get a complete record for each person. So that's one example of how we did that. And these are the supplementary questions. So there were, and I didn't say this, there were 35 of just the general schedule questions, but there were 15 supplementary questions, and we asked questions about veteran status, and that actually changed. An instruction to the enumerator was to mark someone as a veteran, even if it was in peacetime. It didn't matter if it was peacetime or war efforts. For persons 14 years and over, here we've got, again, a little more information about, this is how we got to it, usual occupation, usual industry, right? So what they had been trained to do instead of what maybe they were doing at that particular point in time. And again, this was a 5% sample. And then we've got fertility. This was the first time we asked questions about fertility as well. There's a lot of firsts. This was the first decennial that we counted transients in a one-day operation, which we still do to this day. We did in the 2010 census as well. So a little information on conducting the 1940 census. Geographers created over 175,000 maps as guides for the enumerators. And of those enumerators, well, we've got about over 120,000 enumerators that actually counted 132 million residents. The cost was in the millions. It was $67.5 million for the entire census. And still, we were still using the punch cards at this time. So, but you can see here census workers who are putting that information on the punch cards. And this actually, for the reason I include this picture, this big portfolio, that's actually where the enumerators would write in the information, these large portfolios. Some somewhat local information here. The 1940 census told us that North Carolina population was a little over 3.5 million. North Carolina gained one representative from this census. The 1930 census was the first time that the reapportionment had occurred since 1910. I believe it was in 1911 when they actually set that number to 435 representatives total, which remains today. So there's a real battle for those 435. The 5 most populous counties, pretty similar to what we see today: Guilford, Mecklenburg, Forsyth, Wake, and Buncombe. 5 least populous counties: Camden, Tyrrell, Dare, Clay, and Graham. And the 1940 census counted over 820,000 dwelling units. Actually, 570,000 had no shower or bath, and 316,000 did have running water inside. So it's an interesting picture, right, of the 19... I would not have guessed that. The 72-year rule. Confidentiality and disclosure avoidance is very important to the Census Bureau. So this 72-year rule is one way to at least protect the confidentiality for 72 years. So for 72 years after the census is conducted, only the person actually named on the record or their legal heir can request census records. Okay, and you can do that if you ever need a record. You can contact me and I can send you the link to the form. Say if your birth certificate was destroyed or you never got one and you need proof of birth for, say you're applying for Social Security benefits or you want to get a passport for foreign travel and you don't have a birth certificate, you're in trouble. So you can contact me and I can provide you with the form. You fill it out and there is a $65 fee, but it's congressionally mandated. It always makes me feel better to say that, like somehow it's not my fault. But of course, after 72 years, the census records are released to the public. I just think it's a really funny, it says, William L. Austin, director of the census, stresses the fact that census takers will be punished if they tattle. And he just looks so stern. But they would be, and we still are today. We're subject to 2 years in jail or a $250,000 fine or both. What's really interesting is I had always assumed that the 72-year rule was because at the time that it was enacted, that was the average life expectancy. Well, it turns out there's another story. There was a 1921 fire at the Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C. that destroyed much of the 1890 census. Here's an example of one of the records. It almost looks like a big ink blot, right, where it was almost destroyed by this fire. Of course, with the water used to fight the fire, that, added to the issues with the forms. But some of them still remain. So there was certainly a need for a permanent federal archives. When it opened in 1935, and then shortly thereafter, 7 years after, the records were transferred from the Department of Commerce to the National Archives. That year was 1942. And once they were released, the 1790 to 1870 census data was open to the public immediately. So it was 72 years, right, after the 1870 census that they were released. So that really established the precedent, which I thought was an interesting story. So just remember, you're going to get the population census only. Housing records were destroyed, but you do get a little bit of housing information. The National Archives and Record Administration online database will not be name indexed. So what that means is that if you want to locate a person, you can't just type in a name. You need to know their address, and then you have to locate their enumeration district. If the person that you're looking for was not home on the first day of enumeration, they didn't get counted on that first day, they're going to be, I think, on page 61. 61 is the day where I guess when they went back for a second time. That's what I believe. So don't fret if you can't find them immediately in the record. So again, a lot of digging. The National Archives has a page on step-by-step how to begin your research. So that may be a good place to start. The individual records, this is the website, it's 1940census.archives.gov. If you want more information like I provided you with today, you can certainly go to the Census Bureau. I think really has done a great job of providing some online resources. Of course, North Carolina State Library, which I had mentioned, National Archives. I thought this was kind of neat that they have a dedicated email address now. It's 1940census@nara.gov for questions as well. And this BC 600, this is just to remind me again, if you do need proof of age, a sort of proof of that you existed in the United States at a certain time for legal issues, you can let me know and I can send you that form. This is my contact information, just kelly.karras@census.gov. So if you ever want census data, I'm definitely the person to come to. So if you want to know more recent data, information from the 2000 census or the most recent decennial at any level of geography, I will be able to provide that to you. So this was the oldest record I could find from my family from 1880. Thank you.